Welcome to Government Records Management in Georgia. My name is Christine Garrett, and I am the Manager of Records Management at the Georgia Archives. The Records Management Program consists of state government records, local government records, electronic records, and the State Records Center. I have been at the Georgia Archives since September 2014. Before coming to Georgia, I worked at the Alabama Department of Archives and History. The official Code of Georgia Annotated, referred to as OCGA during this talk, contains the Georgia Records Act. The Act describes how government records in Georgia should be handled. The Georgia Archives Records Management Program gets its authority from the Georgia Records Act. I will mention some of the specific citations during my talk. The OCGA has a lengthy legalese definition of records management. This is a more informal, less wordy definition of records management that I give to state and local government agencies. Records management encompasses all of the activities done to a record throughout its life cycle, from creation to final disposition. Creation, use, access, storing, these are just some of the activities that happen to a record during its lifetime. Final disposition is either permanent. These are records that are deemed to have enough historical value to warrant their keeping and preservation in an archives, or temporary, records that will be destroyed at some point. Depending on the agency, most government agencies have only 5 to 15% of their records being permanent. The governor's office has a higher percentage of permanent records due to the important duties and decisions made in the office. The state archives also has a higher percentage of permanent records due to being the repository of permanent records for the state. In Georgia, the state archives only takes the permanent records of state agencies and USG institutions that do not have their own archives. University System of Georgia institutions, such as Clayton State, with their own archives, and local government agencies are responsible for maintaining their permanent records. You'll notice that I have put prior to in parentheses before creation. Some records require planning before they are created. Prior to electronic records, cartographers had to plan out their maps before creating them. They had to figure out scale, what information to include in the map, and so forth. When it comes to electronic records, databases are a great example of complex records that need to be planned out before they're created. Ideally, IT records managers, those entering data into the database, and anyone who needs records from the database would sit down and determine the fields, how the information will be entered into each field, ensure records management and IT needs are met, and so forth. I once worked with an agency that had staff that decided to take data entry sheets that they had that were permanent and enter them into a database. They did not have the database at the time. They brought the idea to their IT staff, who thought it was a great idea, but said that they were in the middle of a project and would not be able to assist them in 2 weeks. Because the staff wanted the database then, they hadn't thought about it until that day, but they wanted it that day, they went around IT and created the database on their own. Not having IT skills, they created a database that in such a way that they were unable to extract the information, which meant that whenever that database system was done away with, they would have to re-enter manually all that information into the new database. When they created this database, the agency was already considering getting rid of this database system. A little bit of planning and waiting, and they would not have had this issue. All the information that went into that database was permanent. So they put permanent records at risk only because they could not wait 2 weeks to work with IT. The OCGA has 2 citations to define public records. A public record is anything created in the course of government business that documents its work. The records belong to the government, not to the person who creates them. This has been in the news over the past 2 years. It has also come up in assigning patent ownership to scientists who work at universities. The universities get the patent, not the scientist, as the scientists are considered working for the university, and therefore their work belongs to the university. Public does not necessarily mean open to the public. There are laws restricting access for security and privacy reasons. Sometimes records that seem like they should be open aren't due to the information contained in them. The Alabama Crime Victims Compensation Commission's meeting minutes from the 1970s to the mid-1990s or so had to be closed because identifying information, including contact information of the victims, was included in the minutes. While meeting minutes are almost always open, the sensitive nature of the content meant that the records had to be closed in order to protect the safety of the victims. This slide looks at some of the benefits of managing records. First, managing records reduce cost and time wasted because only the records that are needed are kept, and knowing where those records are and what they are makes it easier to locate them. If records aren't managed and the records room looks like the one on the screen, it takes staff a long time to locate just one record. That is staff time wasted, as well as the employee's pay is wasted because they're spending an hour and all that pay just to locate one record. If the agency's electronic records are managed like this as well, it will take staff time to find that file that they need due to poor records management with electronic records, including poor naming conventions and poor file organization. The second reason is to decrease liability. I doubt most government employees are doing anything illegal. There's always a chance that someone may have at some point, or something has happened at some point in the time that might not have been completely legal. Even without anything being illegal, inconsistent records keeping practice can raise suspicion. If an agency rarely destroys records that are eligible for destruction and has a period of time in which they fully comply with records retention schedules, or they only destroy certain types of records, they can raise suspicion, even if nothing was done. And we prefer not to raise suspicion. While I don't have an example of records being a liability in the public sector, I do have one from the private sector. An airplane engine manufacturing company was sued over accidents caused by its engines failing. The lawsuit claimed that the company knew of the faults before the accidents happened and failed to do anything to stop the accidents and stop the faults. The company claimed that it was not aware of the problems until after the accidents happened and moved to correct them after they started having problems. During legal discovery, it appeared that the company was telling the truth, as there appeared to be no records documenting that the company knew of the problems ahead of time. That was until a folder was found that had a napkin from a nearby restaurant. One day, the engineers from that company had gone out to lunch, taken a napkin, drawn the engine on it, and labeled all the deficiencies. For some reason, they decided to bring the napkin back and put it in a file folder. Somehow there was a date attached to it. Maybe they put the date, maybe the receipt was there. But whatever the case, investigators were able to prove that napkin was done before these accidents happened. Therefore, the company knew the engine had issues. And because of that napkin, the company lost the lawsuit. The company is now no longer in existence because the lawsuit was such a financial burden that they had to be bought out by somebody else in order just to survive. While I'm not supporting companies, hiding issues, I support responsibility and accountability. However, had that napkin not been kept, the company would never have been caught. And you never know what could be in an agency's records. So best to get rid of them as soon as possible. Thirdly, you protect the records. Part of records management is properly storing and securing the records. This includes proper climate and environmental conditions, something as archivist I'm sure you're aware of, not just for paper records, but electronic records. Storing the records properly, making sure they're in archival quality storage, whether it's acid-free boxes or storage devices, electronic storage devices like portable hard drives that last a long time and designed to last a long time, as well as securing the records, making sure that the physical room itself is locked and limited access is given. And that way you can reduce loss by accident or purposeful loss. You can reduce that risk by managing records. Records management can also improve customer service. When records are protected from loss and agencies know what they have and where it is, they can quickly serve the public. There is a connection between the efficiency of a records management program and the efficiency of an entity. If an entity has a strong records management program, then more than likely it is a smoothly operating agency. If it has a poor records management program, likely it has management and organizational issues. Finally, records management can affect reputation. Now, government agencies likely will not get any attention for having a great records management program, unless they're dealing with people who have experienced the effects of poor records management at a similar agency. Poor records management might get more noticed. There's an example of a university, which is not in Georgia or Alabama, I won't name where it is, that once had so many issues with its records management that upperclassmen would tell incoming students to be sure to keep multiple copies of every record. I knew a senior who went there who had to give the university copies of all of her records, not just proof of payment of bills, but all of her financial aid, her application, her acceptance letter, even her transcripts. No student should ever expect to have to turn proof of their grades to the school that they got the grades from. And not did she have to do this once, but 4 times she had to turn all of these documentation over, as well as various other times when she'd have to turn over like the proof of payment of a bill. And this wasn't just her, it happened to other students. Not surprisingly, because of this, the school earned a reputation for poor records management, probably not the best place to go if you want to make sure you graduate on time and not have to fight the system to prove that you should graduate. And in the state where this school is, they like to take the acronyms of the universities and change them to reflect of a scandal that's happened. And there they basically changed the acronym for that university to don't go there, go somewhere else. And poor records management was at the basis of that problem. Records retention schedules are the basis of our work with government agencies. They establish the minimum length of time that a record must be kept. The schedules include schedule number and title, a description of the content of the record, and the minimum retention. The schedules have the full effect and force of the law and are located on the Archives website. Since 2015, we've also included the date that the schedule was last updated. Here's an example of some of the schedules. These are from the financial section of the local government schedules. Every record must have a schedule in order for it to be destroyed, sent to the state archives, or sent to the state record center. Many of the schedules are vague in order for multiple individual records to fall under them. For example, student records in K through 12 contain transcripts, program-related records that the individual student is involved with, such as gifted, English as a second language, so forth, standardized testing, and other records that document a student's time in school. Common schedules cover records that most agencies create, such as accounting records, while specific schedules cover schedules that are specific to the functions of individual agencies. Adoption records, for example, are only held by probate courts and DHS, the Department of Human Services, which oversees DFACS. If other agencies have adoption records, they are part of a different record that doesn't have to do with adoption, but has something to do with proof of guardianship or something like that, just a copy. Records retention schedules must be updated on a regular basis to ensure they continue to meet the needs of the records, the agency, the state or locality, the people, and the law. Ideally, schedules would be reviewed every year to ensure that they are current. Georgia Records Management staff work with agencies to update schedules. Once the schedules have been revised and reviewed by Georgia Archive staff, they go to the State Records Committee, which will vote on the schedules. Once approved by the State Records Committee, the schedules go into effect. The State Records Committee is the state agency responsible for approving schedules. It is made up of the Chancellor of the Board of Regents, who serves as the chair, and he does so because the archives is part of the university system. He is joined by the Governor, State Auditor, and Secretary of State, and these four individuals usually have a representative serving for them. The Governor also appoints a member who is currently with the Department of Revenue, and a local government official also serves, and currently the individual is a city clerk. Obviously, these individuals are not the ones spending the time updating the schedule, which is why the government the records management staff of the Georgia Archives serves as the staff of the State Records Committee. And as a little interesting tidbit, when the State Records Committee was founded, it was during Jimmy Carter's governorship, and he, as governor, attended the meetings, which was very helpful because having authority behind it, like the governor, really helps drive home the importance of records management. When revising state agency-specific schedules, we work directly with the agency's records management officer, the RMO. We work only with the RMO and not just anybody from the agency. The RMO is the person who's in charge of the records management function at that agency. Unfortunately, in most instances, that is not their only duty. It's often other duties assigned. So we try to help them as much as we can. And we want to only work with one person so that we know the information that comes to us has hopefully been vetted by other entities, everybody in that agency who should have vetted it. If multiple people are sending us comments and review, we don't know or wouldn't know how much others had input, because sometimes people will try to go around the RMO and everybody else to get their way, and their way might not be what the agency wants. So we go through the RMO. We have a template, which I have in here in a little bit later. Prior to their schedules going to the State Records Committee, we insist that their legal office reviews the schedules, because these are the law. And we want to make sure that their legal department thinks that these can stand up in the court of law. For other schedules, whether it's the University System of Georgia, state common schedules, or local schedules, we work with roundtables that's made up of individuals from whatever entity, that type of entity that's those schedules are for. So for example, I just helped local education get their schedules updated. So we had a roundtable of individuals from various school boards around the state. And the roundtable is who goes through the schedules, reviews them, makes suggestions, and we work on the update together. We want a roundtable that is representative of various entities across the state. We don't want just one school district when it goes, like for example, of the school boards, one school district determining what everybody else in the state has to do. That school district might be an anomaly, or people just don't want one entity telling them what to do. So having as many as possible on that roundtable means we're going to get all the differences that happen, as well as it feels like it's a more group effort and less of one entity telling them what to do. And then once the roundtable has gotten to the point that they like the schedules, it goes to a person who's not on the committee or roundtable, a couple other people maybe, and we have them review it. Because when you have a group of people sitting together and talking about things over a course of months, it's likely that there's things that they come to understand with those schedules that you have to really be in on the meetings to know why it's like that. And so others from the outside wouldn't know all the information. So we want to make sure that what we're recommending is understood by others who are not part of that committee. This is the template we use when we're revising state agency specific schedules. The information that we gather is the same that was gathered on the original application forms used in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And we try to gather all this information so that we can learn as much as possible about these records so that we make informed decisions on retention, but also to help the agencies think through about these records. And we don't use the old application forms because the forms were 2 pages and only would fit one schedule. And by having all the schedules go on the same spreadsheet, agencies as well as us can see, in one glance we can see all of the schedules. We might have to scroll down some, but it's a lot easier to compare and contrast and to see related schedules if they're on one spreadsheet as opposed to having to lay out all these sheets of paper. When the schedules go to the records committee meeting, they don't contain all of this information. We just keep the title, the function and description, and the retention, as well as a column that tells them, if it's a revision, what has been changed from the previous schedule. Retention is determined by evaluating the 4 values that the records can have. The easiest value to figure out is legal, and that means that there's somewhere either in the OCGA, rules and regulations for Georgia, or the Federal Code of Regulation, there's a law that says these records must be kept this amount of time. So for example, grant records in the CFR says that these records have to be kept 3 years after submission of the final report, and the final report is permanent. So that is the retention. If state and federal law conflict, we go with the longest retention of the 2. We never undermine the law. The next easiest is fiscal, because that's tied to accounting. Historical are the records that have been deemed to have enough permanent value for them to be kept permanently to warrant the cost of keeping them in an archives. Administrative is the hardest because it's the most subjective. Sometimes there are best practices to guide us, but a lot of the time, you're talking to an agency. Some people want to keep a certain record, forever, and somebody else would say, well, once I'm done with it, we don't need it. So you have to find a happy medium. What we usually do is talk to them and say, okay, you have this record. Do you go back and reference it or use it in any way in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years? We try to find when they stop using it and making that the cutoff. Sometimes we'll look at other states to get guidance from them, especially if it's one there's a lot of questions about whether or not it should be a short-term or long-term record. We look to see what other states have done. Retention is determined by the content of the record, not the format. It does not matter what format the records are in, as long as the content, that's all we're caring about. So timesheets, it does not matter if it's a paper timesheet, if it's an email, somebody emails their time, they go into an electronic system and submit it. All of that is kept 4 years in settlement of all claims. In the past, when they originally did schedules, they sometimes had multiple formats, and each format would have its own retention. So they could have, the paper was 6 years. The microfilm A was 12 years. Microfilm B was permanent. This computer file was 3 years. It really was just It made no sense and really lost the focus of the content determining the retention. So we don't do that anymore. It is also not tied to account or device. If it's, as I mentioned earlier with public records, public record is anything created in the course of government business. So if people create government records in their personal accounts or on their personal devices, they still count as public records. This was, of course, big in COVID when people had to work from home. Their office may not have enough computers for them to be working on a work-issued computer. So they might have had their records, their work records on their personal devices and had to get them off as soon as possible. At some point a few years ago, there was a governor, not Georgia, Alabama, or Florida, don't remember what governor he was, who got into office and decided that he was going to do some kind of illegal scheme, because naturally that's exactly what you want your governor doing. And he came up with this idea even before he was sworn in, which is really reassuring. He knew that if he was caught, they would go after his governor's email account. And a lot of the transactions in business was going to be through email. So he set up a Google account, Google email. And sure enough, he got caught and they went after his governor's email account. There was nothing in it. And they could tell pretty quickly on that this Gmail account was where all the records were. And so they subpoenaed it. He said, no, that's my personal email account. You can't touch it. And they said, nope, we have proof that you have government records in it. You have to turn it over. And so he did. And while, again, I don't think government employees are really sitting there doing anything illegal, but at the same time, we don't want to have our phones and devices to just be open to discovery by anybody. I mean, do you really want everybody looking at all your cats or photos of your kids? It just doesn't need to be happening. It's poor records management not to have them in the proper account on the proper device. I'm going to briefly discuss digitization. And the reason I'm doing this is because the most frequent question I get is, can we digitize our paper records and get rid of them? In Georgia, the answer is yes. And these are the OCGA citations that allow agencies to do so. I get asked this question so much that I actually have an email template that I just copy and paste and send to people. It includes these citations, a little bit more information about them, as well as recommendations for agencies on scanning records. There are some judges that do not like the idea that you can just use electronic copies instead of the paper originals. However, there is no place in law that says you have to use the paper. So things that I talk about with them, and I'm sure you've gone over this in class or in your classes, digital records, regardless if they're scanned images or born digital, have to remain authentic, accessible, and usable throughout their entire life cycles. I have dealt with records that came from an agency that sunsetted around 2002, and I had the difficulty working with those because they were all on floppies. Thankfully, the 3.5 inch, which I have a USB drive for, so I was able to access them. If I didn't have that drive, I would have been in trouble because 3.5 inch floppy drives have been in computers for a while. CD drives aren't really in computers now. But I also had the problem, not only on floppies, but I had to deal with files that were created even before Word 95. On my computer at the time, I had Word 2016. And it added all this weird coding to documents. Some documents were supposed to be about 5 pages, and they ended up being 832 pages, with 5 pages of the wording and 827 pages of nonsense coding, plus coding mixed in with the words, which really affected the authenticity as well as the usability. We do stress with agencies to use portable hard drives and discuss the technological obsolescence with storage media and software. We also talk about the media degradation. And one of the things that we talk about a lot is gold CDs. When I came on to archives back in 15 years ago, gold CDs were considered something that were going to last 50 years. Allegedly 50 years because they had been tested to last 50 years. I personally have issues with people telling me something's going to last 50 years when it hasn't been around for 50 years. Lab tests are not the same as life, and it's turned out that you can really only trust them for 5 years. So there's a lot of entities, including archives around the country and probably around the world, that have permanent records sitting on these gold CDs that they better get off. We also stress, of course, the importance of keeping their records secure, their electronic records secure, cybersecurity, accidental stuff happening. And for my cybersecurity photo, I usually try to use a photo of my cats. And this is of my cat Simba, who sadly no longer is with us. But even at an early age, you can see he was trying to hack my computer. When talking to agencies about digitizing, we stress that they should have a good reason to digitize, not just digitizing because they have a scanner, and that sounds like something fun to do, really to have a purpose. And some of the reasons that they can have are freeing up physical space. We've had a lot of agencies move lately. They sold one of the buildings in downtown Atlanta, so that agency had, all those agencies in there had to move out. And just other entities do move at times. And rent, as we all know, is expensive. So they're trying to reduce the amount of space that they take up. And with COVID and more people working from home, they can really see the advantage of doing this, trying to save money. And if you have a whole room of records that can be digitized, it makes more sense sometimes. Not only does it take up less space, but it increases access. So if you have education records or court records and that multiple people in an entity may need to work on at one time, if they can all work on them because they're digitized and they don't have to wait for somebody to get done with a paper version to give them the paper and then pass it on to somebody else, it speeds up productivity. And then you can also, depending on what's in those records, you can provide better access to the public. And you can fulfill open records requests. There's certain records that you know are going to be requested, and once they get requested one time, you can have them scanned, and then somebody comes and asks for it again, they can just give them the scan. And finally, there's disaster planning. At the Georgia Archives, we do a lot of disaster planning training, or we try to do a lot of it, and we really focus on what records an agency needs to have. They're called essential records. So the idea is basically if a tornado came and wiped out everything and they had to work from a FEMA trailer, they didn't have access to their server, but they might have computers, they might not have computers, what records would they absolutely have to have in order to respond to, recover from that disaster, as well as get the agency operating with their core functions. And we advise them to digitize those records. And ideally, they would have paper and digital versions of them, because you never know with a disaster what kind of access you can have. You might not have computers with the software you need, so they may need the paper. But also, if you have a disaster, say you have a flood happening and rapid rising water, it may be where they can grab portable hard drives and get out, and that's how they save their records. And because you can't always get all those paper records out of the way. We do stress that they have plans and not just sit down and digitize. There was a county that got a huge grant years ago. I don't know which county it is, not that I would call them out, but they got this huge grant to digitize all of their records. So they just started scanning. And the only plan they had was to start with their older records first. Well, they ran out of money, and they still had a lot of newer records to go, but they really wanted scanned. And when they went back and looked at those records that they had scanned, the vast majority of them had already reached their retention period. So they could have finished and gotten everything scanned that they needed to had they implemented records management and shredded things that they didn't need and got rid of that stuff. You know, I stress when I talk to people that if you don't have good records management with your paper records, you're going to have a bigger mess with your electronic records because of things like this. You can't just start managing your records with electronic records. You really want to get them handled as physical records. And just plan. And another thing about a situation like that is when a grant is not successful. And that would be a non-successful grant. They got some of the project done, but not all of it. Those granting agencies remember, and going back to reputation from an earlier slide, it can get harder to get grant funding if those granting agencies know that an institution has not fulfilled their grant before. So we ask them that and stress that they should really do a project plan with a defined purpose. That defined purpose may be, we need to clean out this room because we're going to use it for office space. Or there's an agency, a local agency that I've worked with that was contracting, and they go back and digitize. If they have to go touch a contract, they digitize it. That way they're only digitizing those contracts that are still being used. If they don't ever use it until it gets destroyed, there's no reason to digitize it. We say, what's the scope? What records are you scanning and the time period? We ask them to look at cost and remind them that you have initial and ongoing. Initial is the equipment, the cost of scanning, getting the program, all of that. But there's also the ongoing. They're going to have to migrate to new systems. They're going to have to manage those records. They're going to have to get new media. They need to think about it. You don't just scan and throw everything on the server. We tell them look at equipment. There are those scanners that come with copiers that just, you feed them. They're great, but if you've got older records or different size records or different thickness, they might not be the best things because they will just eat those records and you lose them in the scanner, which is not good. It's like at the Georgia Archives, we have a scanning department to scan records for the archives, and they use flatbed scanners that way to protect the fragile records. We tell them when to use vendors or in-house. There are benefits to both. Vendors, of course, are more experienced. However, they often scan at their own site and they take those records away, so you don't have access to them. On site, you have your records, but you're pulling staff or temps into it and it's taking away from other work. We advise them to have electronic records management systems to store those records, to make them more accessible and managed, ideally with retention built in where they could just go across and query for everything that's eligible for destruction and determine from there if they want to destroy it. Don't let the system destroy without permission. Unfortunately, and it's not just with digitized records, but with records management, for electronic records management in general, agencies tend to get rid of the records management piece if they try to save money. That's like the first piece to go. So shifting to the general work of the Georgia Archives records management staff, we have a few things we tend to do. We answer questions, provide trainings, make on-site visits, update schedules, and operate the State Records Center. We've already touched on updating schedules, but we're going to look at these other areas. So we do a lot of answering records management questions. One is they're not sure what records retention schedule applies. I mentioned that they can be vague. Another example of vague records are the routine accounting records. When the schedules were updated for university system and state common schedules, which were in 2016, and the local version in 2016, whichever is next year. We took about 25 individual routine accounting schedules and combine them into just one, because we were getting questions about accounting type records that should be considered, would be considered one of those types of records, or that type of record where it would have that retention, but because it didn't have a specific schedule, it couldn't be destroyed. So we try to, make it so you can include more things in case somebody names something different or you have an oddball record. Sometimes they need to know what schedule was in place at a specific time. This is especially true when schedules are updated and they get a longer retention period. This doesn't happen a lot, but it can. So for example, up until 2017, the local law enforcement schedules had internal investigations. They were 20 years. For some reason in 2017, it was decided to include them with the personnel records, employee personnel file, which for local agencies is 7 years after separation, and then they're destroyed. So if agencies were following their schedules exactly, now they could get rid of 13 years of records because they only need those 7. And the idea thinking that most likely if they have the 20-year internal investigations, those people got fired, so they'd only have 7 years after employment. This past spring, we brought the schedule back because we got a lot of questions about it. If I got a call from a local law enforcement entity, I knew that was what they were going to ask. It was that frequently asked for. And so we decided to bring it back, not just because there were questions about where the schedule is, but it was turning out that people knew about this schedule and knew that if they had been a police officer and they had gotten fired for a cause for whatever an internal investigation had found, all they had to do was wait 8 years or so, and there'd be no proof of why they were fired, and they were coming back or trying to come back. So it was determined we need to bring the schedule back and have a longer retention, because you don't want a police officer or somebody in that kind of field who got fired for cause to come back to work because there aren't any records that prove that they shouldn't be doing that. Well, now it's back to being 20 years, but anybody in the past 5-6 years who followed those schedules, they might not have them. They might not have, however many years worth of schedules or records that they looks like they should have. So if anybody asks, which those are a schedule that we can see people asking for to see those records, they can contact us and we can send them that record so that they have proof that they did indeed follow what was in place at the time. Then email retention and scanning are 2 other topics I get a lot of questions about. I've already hit a little bit on scanning, and email is a nightmare because email is not considered a type of record. It is a format. It is a way to get records from point A to point B, communications, and it's based on the content of the email itself and any attachments, which complicates things because you can't just say all our email is 3 years, which is what people want to hear. So moving on to trainings. Back in January, we updated our website to include the list of trainings that we give, which is kind of hard for me because I do on-demand trainings and just ask people, what do you want to hear from? What kind of information do you want? And so I had to put in categories. So basic records management is one that I offer to anybody with an agency. It can be agency-wide. It can just be a few people. The RMO training is for the records managers. Inventory is for when we have entities that have a backlog of records and they don't know where to start or how to, they're just overwhelmed. And so we go in there and help them understand how to start inventorying and get the process going. We can sit there and help them that day. We can't keep coming back, but we can get them going. Talk about how to digitize records, electronic records management. We do disaster training and how to use the State Records Center, or in localities or places that don't use the State Records Center, actually localities would be those, and when I set up their own records center, we teach them how to do that. The trainings are given over Teams or in person. My predecessor used to travel around the state, and he was on the road all the time. That got expensive, so I don't travel nearly as much. If we're going to travel to, a place 4 hours away, it's helpful if we have a group of people instead of just one person, but we try to do whatever we can. We do not charge for our trainings or our visits. I do have free up there with some asterisks, and I'll explain that in a little bit. I try to keep the trainings to under 2 hours. Records management training is not very interesting, so we don't want to bore them to tears. We do it by demand, and we tailor it to the audience, and they can mix and match. A lot of people will say, well, we want electronic records and digitizing. Well, that works together. A couple of other trainings that we haven't done yet, but I really want to do. This comes from Alabama, where when I was there, we did these. When we'd work with state agencies to update their schedules, we would have a meeting prior to the project starting. And hopefully it would either be everybody in the agency, or if it was a large agency, everybody dealing with records, all the administration, IT, legal, and hopefully people from each section, usually the heads. And we would explain the importance of records management, the importance of keeping the schedules updated, and how this project would work. And especially with a lot of RMOs not being in legal or administration, but a lot of them tend to be in like file clerks and low-level positions where it can be very hard for them to be taken seriously by those higher up. Having us come in can sometimes give them a little bit more help to getting projects going, and then implementing schedules after they're updated. We've had the momentum, we've done all that work on the schedules, now let's keep the momentum going and get records management going. Some places it's a good kickoff to reinvigorate a records management program that is in shambles or needs a reboot. Or maybe they've had a lot of staff changes, so it's a good time to get retrained. And this is the picture in here is from a disaster training. Actually, this is a staged photo. We wanted to have a photo from our presentation, and we forgot to get the photo, so we staged it with staff members at the time. And that's from, like I said, a disaster training. You can see the file cabinet sitting there, and that was a tornado that hit in Coleman, Alabama in 2011. And it kindly left the filing cabinet where everybody could find it. We provide disaster guidance, so we work with our conservation staff. It can be, we talk about how to create disaster plans, we can respond to disasters. So if a place is affected by a disaster, we can visit and provide help. When Hancock County had the fire at their courthouse back in 2014, we brought microfilm to replace the records that they lost in the fire. When I was in Alabama, we would do the same thing here. After the 2011 tornadoes, we visited various places that had been hit. And I remember we visited a town that had part of town hall ripped off. Town hall was very small, and it shared a building with the fire department. Upstairs is where they kept most of their records. Fortunately, they had had a training where they learned to put their permanent records in a safer place, because without the roof, or part of the roof, the records got wet. And the person who was managing this was a town clerk, but she also did everything else, because the only employees of the town for town hall were the mayor and her. So she kept everything going. She had a lot of stuff she was trying to deal with, and just having people come in and say, yes, you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, was helpful reassurance that, okay, I've got this handled. Let me focus on other things. So we do have a training program that we give. It's from the Council of State Archivists, which is made up of the 50 state archives and 6 territorial archives. That was made with FEMA, and it was following Hurricane Katrina, when after Katrina they realized most disaster recovery programs did not include records, which caused a lot of problems trying to recover because you need your records. So there is an 8-hour course on identifying the records that you need, and an 8-hour course on protecting those records and recovering from a disaster. And we tend to give those once a year, each course once a year. We didn't do this year, and hopefully we're going to build on it next year to do some hands-on mold remediation and wet salvage so that people can mess with stuff that doesn't matter if it gets destroyed and get practice with it before they deal with their actual records. And we want to have people come in who have gone through a disaster, because there's a huge difference between listening to what you should do and what actually happens. Have cybersecurity come in and just really up that presentation. We do on-site visits. Again, these are free. Places are overwhelmed by backlogs. I think I have a dozen places I've talked to that nobody's done any records management for over a decade. And they have a lot of paper records. We don't even get into electronic records. They're just talking about paper. And they can have rooms and buildings just full of paper, and they don't know where to start. They don't want to leave it to the next people, next people coming through after them. So where to start? We can do a site assessment. There's always the ideals of what kind of room they should have for their records. And then there's the reality of this is what they get, which is usually what it is. And so we can go out there and give advice about how to better make that room safe for them. So there are some entities where their records room have pipes in the walls because it backs up to a bathroom or backs up to who knows what. And it's like, well, there's a pipe there. Let's move those records away from the wall. We can go out if there's a new records management person there or new staff, like maybe they've had a whole new turnover with staff. Or if it's an elected office, they can often, after the election, get new staff. Or if they're starting or revamping their records management program. Sometimes just going there and helping is a lot, and being there in person is a lot more helpful than just sitting there and listening to a presentation online. So we also operate the State Records Center. We have 3 vehicles, which you see here. And this is the back of the State Records Center. The OCGA requires all state agencies to store records at the Record Center if they have a long-term retention and they don't need them, or even short-term retention and don't need them on site. Now, not every agency does this. Some of them, they have room on site, so they keep it on site. There have been some that have used commercial vendors, and we're trying to get them to not use commercial vendors. One thing that's important to know before we really get into the State Records Center is to know the difference between the Georgia Archives and the State Records Center. We'll often get calls and people saying, we need to send this to archives. And we think, okay, it's going to the archives. The State Records Center staff does pick up the records that are permanent and take it to the state archives. So we get confused. And after talking to them, we find out they mean the State Records Center. So being archival students, you have an advantage in understanding the difference. Georgia Archives, permanent records, state agencies, or those USG entities that do not have an archives. The records belong to the archives. They sign custody over to the archives. They cannot leave the building after they have come. The agencies who want to see them, they have to go see their own records at the archives. And they have to see them in the reference room and the special area for original documents. They cannot leave because not only are you worried about them not coming back, but you're worried about them being damaged. And the archives, of course, has the climate for the records, and bringing them in and out is damaging to the records. There is no cost to the agency for sending their records to the state archives, not even a pickup cost. For the State Records Center, and this photo is of one of our rows, we have temporary records, which I'll talk about in a second because there's an asterisk there, for state, local, and USG. Basically, if an entity has a records retention schedule created by the state or approved by the State Records Committee, they can store records there. The records belong to the agency, so we're not allowed to just go out there and start reading records if we want to. Not that we have time, but they belong to the agency. They're not our records. We can only go through them when we get requests from the agency to pull them. And there are fees to the agency. So the State Records Center used to just be for state agencies, but when the State Records Center moved from East Point in Atlanta to Austell, kind of near Six Flags, like 3 miles from Six Flags, we moved in 2018. We got a bigger space, so we were able to expand our clientele to local governments. And so we have some local governments that store here as well. Vast majority of records here are temporary because it does not have climate control. It's built a lot better than the old Records Center. Where the old Records Center, if it got too hot in the afternoon on the summer, they would have to stop working, and it could get too hot. Here is built great, so it's a brand new building. We're the first occupant in our suite. It was made for us, so it's built in a way where the climate is a lot better regulated. But we do have permanent records. Some state agencies have permanent records here that they don't send to the archives because they still need them, and they want to be able to access them and be able to bring them back to the agency if they need them. We also have some localities storing their permanent records here because they don't have an archival institution to send them to, and their state records or State Records Center is the best they can store it at. We also do allow agencies to send copies of essential records here. You know, those are the ones they need if it's a disaster. And part of the idea was if a disaster occurs, you know, and you're in Savannah or someplace far away, you really do want a copy of your essential records stored geographically away from your location because, you know, if a hurricane comes through or a major disaster, everybody in the area is going to be affected. So you want your records far enough away where they won't be damaged, so we can store them here. It is only for paper records. We do have some stuff that gets in like microfilm and VHS tapes, CDs, but it's mainly for paper records. Like I said, it is fee-based. And if you look at our fee chart, which is on our website, it'll look like it's more expensive than commercial vendors. However, our fees are right there. That's every fee that we charge. We don't have any other fees. Commercial vendors tend to have hidden fees, and one of the worst fees they have is called a hostage fee, in which they will charge entities that decide to leave. They will charge them tens of thousands of dollars to leave, and they will not give them their records unless they pay it. Now, there's issues about this, of course, because they are not supposed to be able to do that with government records. They don't own the government records. The records, you're not supposed to be able to do that. Just no, but they're powerful. Most of these are national companies, and they do what they want to do. We had an entity that moved out back in December. By December 9th, all their records allegedly were out and at the Records Center. And this is an entity that would charge them, this agency, every month. At the end of the month, they would get a bill for that month. So they got their bill in December, okay, because they were there until December 9th. January came. End of January, no records are there, allegedly, and they got a $20,000 bill. Like, what is this? So not only were they still dealing with them trying to bill them, it turns out they still have like 300 boxes of theirs there. They couldn't find them because they didn't have them organized. Here we can tell you what's on a shelf. We can tell you exactly where your box is, the exact location on our shelf. They had no idea. We try to be less stressful than commercial vendors. You know, we have our rules and policies and procedures, but we also know that sometimes situations come up where we might need to be a little bit more flexible. So with that agency that came from that commercial vendor, the commercial vendor also didn't require any kind of finding aid or information about those boxes. So the agency just knew they had these 1,300 boxes or however many at this commercial vendor. To go on the shelf here, they need to be able to tie them to a retention schedule and the cutoff date, and they really need to know what's in the box for themselves. So they had 1,300 boxes that came over. They're supposed to have all that information before the boxes arrive. So we can just put the labels on and put them on the shelf. Well, that wasn't going to happen, so we let them put them back there until they could get their staff out here to go through the boxes themselves. We had another agency that had a similar situation, but they don't have the staff to come out and go through them. So we will be doing that for them at a $30 per hour fee. We also have records that are sitting in the back that don't have a retention schedule. And if you remember earlier, I said you had to have a retention schedule to send your boxes here. However, they were in a facility or location that the agency rented, and the rent was going to end. The lease was ending that week, but didn't tell the RMO till like last minute. She didn't have a way of getting them organized in time, and they don't have a schedule because it's something new for that agency. I think it transferred from their agency to them. So she was in a bind. What do I do with these records? Where do I send them? Do I need to bring them over here to our main office and then we send them to the record center once they have a schedule? We're like, no, we'll just come and get them because they were not scheduled records that they really needed. We'll get the schedule going to the state records committee meeting in a few months. They can sit back there and then you can come out and go through them and organize them. So we try to make it more accessible for people. We do destruction services. Not only of records here, we will send agencies destruction notices that they have to sign before we destroy them, but also we will go out and pick up records from various entities, agencies that need their records picked up for destruction. We have an agency that's about 90 miles away that we pick up because while we may be more expensive once you pay for gas and our time to go get the records, they had a commercial vendor who turned out to not be very reliable, and they create a lot of destructions. They can't just sit there and wait. So it's easier for us to, or for them, to have us come out and get them and pay more money, but at least they're moving out and they're not just sitting there. Now the media storage vault is not really something done by records management, but I think it's important to point out. At one point in time, it was managed by records management. It's available to state and local government agencies, and it's located in the vault at the Georgia Archives. And it's for backups and copies, I believe, of records that they can send on CDs, DVDs, any type of microform, electronic storage media, and it's held there. There's no charge. It's put in a vault, so it's in proper climate control. The only thing is that when they take them out, because they can request them come back to them, these can leave the archives. They have to put them on a new storage media in order for them to go back. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you for listening. I hope it wasn't long and tedious to listen to. If you have questions, you can email me. That is my email contact. Thank you for listening.